So now we should take a look at how it is that we theoretically within psychology go about explaining language development. B.F. Skinner is going to be a pretty significant contributor to this area of study, and another individual is going to be named Noam Chomsky, and he is also going to be a theoretical contributor, but he and Skinner are going to have divergent ways of explaining language development. For Skinner, learning is established, where language is concerned, through operant conditioning, okay? Because if a child, if you think about it, if they learn to speak and they say their first word, parents get very, very excited, there's lots of positive reinforcement, and so that will get the child to continue to further their language development. Okay, it can also be explained based on learning principles, specifically association or imitation. Okay, we model what our parents tell us. You can see many scenarios where a parent will try to say, "Can you say?" and then they'll give a word, banana, or something along those lines, and the child will repeat it. So they're modeling what the parent presents to them. Kids learn to speak because being rewarded for making sounds that are close to adult speech is basically a form of shaping. It gets them to learn more and to acquire an understanding of language through that means of positive reinforcement, in shaping them to get to the correct word. Now, Noam Chomsky, on the other hand, actually opposes what Skinner says, and he says that there's something, vastly different that's going on here. Basically, what he argues is that we have this kind of natural language acquisition device born within us that we all have, because for him, the rate of language acquisition is so quick that it just can't be explained by learned principles or reward or, modeling. Okay, so for him, it has to be inborn within us. And so he supports the idea that languages have universal grammar. Okay, they have similar underlying structure to them, irregardless of what the specific language happens to be. And he argues that basically what happens where this is concerned is that a switch gets flipped, basically, once we are exposed to language in our environment, and there's some kind of neural framework that's established in our brain that enables us to acquire and develop an understanding of language and then to be able to speak it as well. So those are the two diverging thoughts on how we develop our understanding of language. Now, statistical learning and critical periods are very important to take a look at within this theoretical discussion of language development, because well before our first birthday, our brains are able to kind of establish word breaks by analyzing syllables that happen to go together. And so as a result of this, it very much shows that there are critical periods of child development where language is concerned. And so that has a tendency to kind of further this more scientific emphasis of looking at how we develop language. So at the end of all of this, what we'll be looking at is basically which came first. Is it thought processes that further our ability to acquire language? Or is language something that ends up furthering thought processes that we have? And it's hard for us to put our minds around that second part, that language is what influences the thought processes that we have. But in certain languages, for example, there are some words or phrases that don't even exist. And so if that's the case and you've never been raised to think about that particular concept, how do you know that it exists? And if it doesn't exist for you, then you're not thinking about it, and so cognition is not occurring. So let me get to the focal point of this, and that is Benjamin Whorf's emphasis of linguistic determinism, okay? Or another scenario of looking at it is something called the linguistic relativity hypothesis. He argues that language determines the way that we think and perceive the world around us. And what he really emphasizes is this research that he carried out on the Hopi Indians, because he noted in that research they do not have a past tense for verbs in the Hopi language. So therefore, he argued, Hopis couldn't even think about the past because they're not familiar with it. It's not a concept that they have been able to cognate on because it's not been presented to them within their language. So he argues that your language determines the way that you go through and understand and perceive the world around you. When language provides words for objects or events that we can think about, we can look into and think about those items more clearly and to retain them. Okay, so it's easier to think about two colors with two different names than colors with the same name, for example. When there is differentiations within a language, we are able to remember them. So if you were to think about pink, for example, rather than just referring to it all as pink, multiple different shades of it, you could perceive one color as magenta, and then there's another that's as salmon. And it's easier for you, once you have those two pieces of language and words to describe those colors, it's easier to see them in your head and to think about them and to recognize them as separate concepts. So, to a large extent, thinking is language-based, okay? We talk to ourselves, we sing to ourselves, we hum, all right? But we can also think in images, too. Language can be through visual establishments. Just think of sign language, for example. You don't need sound in that manner. It's very much a visual kind of language. But it's interesting to note when it is that we are thinking through imagery rather than sound or words specifically. We don't necessarily think in words when we are presented with certain scenarios. So if I were to say, when you open the hot water tap, what you would actually end up thinking about is you would imagine it. You would be sitting there and you'd be thinking to yourself maybe that you had put your hand under a faucet and you had felt the hot water. Maybe it was really warm and it burnt you, okay? Or when you ride a bicycle, for example, you're not going to think the words ride a bicycle. You're going to have a mental image of you, maybe as a younger kid, or maybe you're really an avid biker right now, riding your bike as I give you those scenarios, okay? So it is important to note that we can think in words and in images as well. Imaging of physical activity within the brain and how we acquire language development. When language is being acquired, physical activity activates the exact same brain regions as it would if you were actually performing an activity. So, for example, as I said, if you were to hear the words riding your bicycle, okay, the area of your brain that would activate would be the exact same area that would enable you to physically perform sitting on a bike, putting your feet on the pedals, and moving. So it's really cool if you think about it that way. So most psychologists believe then that it's probably that our thoughts end up influencing our language. And so as a result, within this scenario of theory, does language influence thought or does thought influence language? They think it goes hand in hand. So it's kind of a cop-out because they don't take one side over another necessarily. It's very much a similarity to the nature versus nurture debate. Are we the way we are with our personality because we are, our genes make us that way, or do we become the way that we are because we are, through our environment and the way that we are raised, furthered to act on certain behaviors within our personality? Psychologists argue that it's both there. So it's the same thing kind of here. They take a very midline stance to this argument of what is essentially more significant, language influencing thought or thought influencing language. So it's a very quick breakdown of language and thought, but if you have any questions, please let me know.